Before we begin, we would like to thank the National Science Foundation Office of Polar Programs for their financial support to ARCIS and to this seminar series. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. Carolina Behe is the Indigenous Knowledge Science Advisor for the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Alaska. As part of the Inuit Circumpolar Council Alaska team, her work is diverse and ranges from topics within food security and biodiversity to management and policy. Within the past couple of years, Carolina has been part of a team with focus on Inuit food sovereignty. Internationally, Carolina acts as the Inuit Circumpolar Council head of delegation on the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna Working Group to the Arctic Council. She brings forward the Inuit Circumpolar Council's position within the Convention on Biological Diversity. Much of the Inuit Circumpolar Council's work within these international forums are focused on ensuring an Inuit perspective and interests are at the table. Additionally, a high amount of focus is placed on the involvement of Indigenous knowledge and promoting the use of co-production of knowledge approach to bring together Indigenous knowledge and science. Carolina's work allows for her to work within two knowledge systems, Indigenous knowledge and science. Indigenous knowledge takes a holistic view and sees how many pieces fit together. Working with this understanding and way of knowing, combined with science, will aid in making adaptive, ecosystem-based decisions. Welcome, Carolina. Please share your screen and we look forward to your presentation.
Okay, Koyana. Okay, just a moment while I get the presentation on slideshow here. Okay, Koyana Arcus, and to everyone here for welcoming us to share about the newly released Circumpolar Inuit Protocols for Equitable and Ethical Engagement. And I think to help let us just focus on the screen here. There we go. As Betsy shared, today we're going to share a little bit about the e-protocols, how they were developed, and take a look at the protocols. We hope to use most of our time to have an active discussion with all of you about implementing the e-protocols, or your thoughts about how you could be implementing the e-protocols. As Betsy shared, I'm Carolina Behe, the Indigenous Knowledge and Science Advisor for ICC, but this work that I share with you today come from hundreds of Inuit and across all of ICC. So for those not familiar with ICC, the Inuit Circumpolar Council was formed in 1977 when Eben Hobson Sr. from Utqiagvik, Alaska, brought Inuit together. His vision was to unite all Inuit across imposed borders to address common concerns with a common voice. Today, ICC advocates on behalf of 180,000 Inuit across Chukotka, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. This map here shows you Inuit Nanat, right? Inuit homelands. We engage in topics such as food security, sustainability, biodiversity, and much more through Indigenous knowledge, science, and policy. ICC holds consultative 2 status at the United Nations and is one of 6 permanent participants at the Arctic Council. Most of our work is done at an international level. For our office, it is extremely important that this work is directed from a community level through our membership organizations. And part of this structure includes holding a General Assembly every 4 years, where Inuit leadership come together to agree upon a declaration that gives ICC its guidance for the following 4 years. To start our discussion, we want to recognize that Indigenous knowledge is a systematic way of thinking applied to phenomena across biological, physical, cultural, and spiritual systems. It includes insights based on evidence acquired through direct and long-term experiences, and extensive and multi-generational observations, lessons, and skills. It has developed over millennia and is still developing in a living process, including knowledge acquired today and in the future, and it is passed on from generation to generation. This definition emphasizes that Indigenous knowledge is a systematic way of thinking, that it holds its own methodologies and evaluation processes. It is about a way of seeing the world, We thought it would be good to start our discussion this way today because the e-protocols are rooted in shared Inuit values, a shared way of seeing the world. As you read the e-protocols, you see an emphasis on a holistic understanding and the importance of looking at all of the pieces that make up the Arctic collectively, the importance of Indigenous communities-driven work, research, decision-making, true collaborative partnerships, and the importance of having Indigenous leadership and knowledge, and the need for a co-production of knowledge to have a holistic understanding, approaches, and adaptive holistic decision-making. To aid us in seeing Indigenous knowledge at work, we have this image. This drawing is made up of Indigenous knowledge. This drawing reflects food security. It reflects a healthy environment. It reflects a worldview. This is the Inuit ecosystem. Some of you have seen this image before. Please try to reflect on this image to help understand how all of these parts are needed. This ecosystem is made up of multiple and diverse parts. Everything shown here is needed and is equally important. You have feast, and these are just as important as the polychaetes, just as important as the zooplankton and the lichen and the beluga. And up here, you have a young boy sharing his first catch with an elder. That is just as important part of this ecosystem as everything else. As one elder explained, the Arctic ecosystem is like puzzle pieces. You have language, sharing, education, and all of this makes up the entire picture. These pieces are continuously adjusting to one another, but are all connected. Sometimes scientists can think of these pieces like systems that are interlinking. Language is part of a system that is interlinked with biodiversity, interlinked with hydrosystems, interlinked with the cryosphere. Another part of this ecosystem is economics. It's everything. A challenge arises when some come and look at only one piece of this puzzle and begin to make policy recommendations without understanding the interconnecting components or understanding cumulative impacts. To make decisions in this ecosystem, to understand this ecosystem, it is important to understand and pay attention to relationships. It is important to understand that the health of this hunter depends on the health of the whale, but also that the health of the whale depends on the health of the hunter. Some may recognize this or relate it to an ecosystem perspective. However, this concept goes beyond that and begins to explain how we are seeing the environment. Humans are part of this ecosystem. Under Indigenous knowledge, this cannot be separated out. This is what a holistic view is. What we decide to work on, what questions we ask, and how we conduct that work, how we make decisions, are all informed by how we are taught to see the world, how we are taught to take information in and use it. So we cannot look at one piece of the puzzle to understand the Arctic. We must consider all the pieces and how they interlink with each other and the importance of understanding cumulative impacts. So why is this important when we're talking about equity? Recognizing that people are part of this environment and the relationships held in this environment allows for us to see the entire picture, the entire puzzle, a holistic understanding. While there is a growing awareness of the importance of Indigenous knowledge and involvement of Indigenous people, many international forums continue to take a top-down approach and are rooted in processes that raise a lot of barriers to the meaningful engagement of Inuit communities and utilization of Indigenous knowledge. There is a need for a paradigm shift in the way that large-scale institutions do their work, how decisions are made, how policy is developed, funding mechanisms, and overall, any work or decisions that impact Inuit homelands. There is a need for true, equitable, and ethical engagement. This has been a call and recommendation that ICC has heard from Inuit for many years. As a result, at the 2018 General Assembly, the adopted Utqiagvik Declaration directed ICC to facilitate the development of international Inuit protocols on equitable and ethical utilization of Indigenous knowledge and engagement of Inuit communities, to provide guidance to international fora such as the Arctic Council and the United Nations bodies. Developing the protocols has been a multi-year process, primarily funded through a grant from the Betty and Gordon Moore Foundation. All of ICC worked collectively to organize and facilitate this effort. To develop the e-protocols, first homework was done. A synthesis report was developed that brought together Inuit values, rules, guidelines, and protocols developed by Inuit from across the Circumpolar. While the report is not exhausted, it did cover a lot. In this process, over 80 documents were reviewed and summarized, and many discussions were held. The synthesis includes important summaries related to engagement through Inuit values, with Indigenous knowledge, with communities, and more. In addition to the synthesis report, we pulled from the many documents developed by ICC. We conducted a review of the many recommendations that have been put forward by Inuit related to this topic, and a reflection of the many barriers and concerns that Inuit have raised. Then the fun part happened. We brought Inuit delegates from Chukotka, Alaska, Canada, and Greenland together through a series of workshops held between September and November of 2022. When we started this work, we assumed we would be meeting in person. Then COVID happened, and we quickly adapted, moving everything to a series of virtual workshops, having phone calls, Zoom meetings, and using every form of communication we could to aid in everyone's participation. This was the first virtual workshop of this magnitude that ICC had organized and facilitated. Thankfully, ARC has partnered with us to aid in the planning and hosting of these meetings. Additionally, we were able to bring in Inuit contractors to aid in facilitating, note-taking, drafting, planning, and cultural performances. While there were many lessons to learn, the overall process was a success, with laughter and again quickly adapting to challenges that arose and being flexible. Following the series of meetings, the e-protocols were drafted and set out to Inuit for review across Inuit Nunat. In June, the Circumpolar Inuit Protocols for Equitable and Ethical Engagement were released. We hope that all of you have had an opportunity to read them. We're going to go over a couple points about them. The e-protocols include 8 protocols. They are nothing about us without us, always engage with Inuit, recognize Indigenous knowledge in its own right, practice good governance, communication with intent, exercising accountability, building trust, building meaningful partnerships, information, data sharing, ownership, and permissions, and equitably fund Inuit representation and knowledge. There are 8 protocols. Each protocol includes a call to action and directives. The e-protocols should be viewed and used collectively. These are not steps to check off. They are all connected and need to be practiced collectively. Here we have a brief example or summary of some of the directives. Again, we strongly encourage all of you to read through them carefully. I appreciate that in all of our very busy schedules, we are used and trained to skimming through materials and picking out specific words. But for this document, it's very important to read every word, to reflect on the language collectively, to recognize that when you come across redundancy, it is there for a reason. All these words are being given to you. I will just highlight a couple of the protocols and directives to get an idea of what some of these are. So when we talk about nothing about us without us, a couple of the directives there are, well, one of specifically is calls for free, prior, and informed consent. If this is new to you, take time to understand what that means. Here, it means that Inuit have a right to say no, a right to say yes with changes, a right to say yes, and a right to change their minds. The next protocol is recognize Indigenous knowledge in its own right. We talked a lot about this at the start of this presentation. Some of the directives under this protocol get to the need to respect Inuit values and to respect that Indigenous knowledge holds its own methodologies, that it should not be put into a scientific box. Practice good governance. This is about being a human being, about how we treat each other. Examples under this directive here have to do with reciprocity, power dynamics, and much more. Communication with intent. A directive under this protocol calls for you to listen more than you speak. And it shares that there's a need to listen, learn, and build relationships to move towards meaningful partnerships and respect. Our discussions are held with a strong intent to take in what we share and move toward understanding each other. There is more to this directive, but overall, it is sharing that the importance of learning from Indigenous peoples and to listen. Exercise accountability. This directive is about capacity. There's many directives under here, but one of them that we're going to highlight is about building your capacity. Take responsibility to build your capacity. Oftentimes we hear conversations and discussions about the need for Indigenous peoples to build their capacity without recognizing that those that are engaging us need to build their capacity. We do need to have focus on our means and ability. We also have a lot of capacity. There's a lot more we can get into with that particular one, but maybe we will during this discussion. The next directive is building meaningful partnerships. Focus on relationship building. We cannot emphasize this enough. We need true relationships, not ones built that based off of what you can get out of that relationship, not transactional relationships, but ones built with respect and trust and humility. Again, what is very important in these protocols need to be placed into practice collectively. It is also important to note that all communities are not the same. All communities have rules, guidelines, laws, and approaches. Some of these are written down, and the e-protocols do not replace existing Inuit protocols, guidelines, laws, or rules. They highlight the commonalities and offer a way forward within international forums. The last two directives that I'll just highlight quick, or protocols I'll highlight quickly, are information, data sharing, ownership, and permissions. An example of one of the directives under the protocols is about accessibility to information and data and reporting back. The last one is equitably fund Inuit representation and knowledge. There's a need for equity within funding structures. This includes recognizing and respecting Indigenous approaches to monitoring, research, gathering information, making decisions, processes needed for co-production of knowledge, funding Indigenous knowledge, and much more. One of the directives under this protocol calls for a need to evaluate, reform, and work to address inequities within funding structures. And again, using all of these collectively and recognizing that Indigenous communities have their own rules and values that need to be followed. As shared before, this work is rooted in Inuit values and stresses many important points such as a holistic approach, respect, trust, listening, humility, and gets to what is really needed for equitable and ethical engagement. Implementation of the protocols by international organizations, institutions, and individuals will require a paradigm shift in how we approach engagement with Inuit, with the utilization of Indigenous knowledge, and ultimately work toward equitable and ethical engagement and partnerships with us to establish a standard for international work, making decisions and developing policies. These protocols provide a foundation for success. For over many years, for all of the aspirations and calls for transformative changes, needs to address urgent changes, efforts towards ecosystem-based approaches, and recognizing the needs for adaptive decision-making. We have heard these over many years from all types of entities and governments about these needs. Working equitably and ethically with Indigenous peoples through partnerships provide real solutions, respecting Inuit sovereignty, self-determination, knowledge, and way of life benefits all of life. If you have not seen a copy of the e-protocols, you can access them on our website at iccalaska.org, or feel free to contact me directly. And if you haven't seen also, the ICC produced podcast called Circumpolar Waves recently released an episode of ICC leadership discussing the e-protocols that you might be interested in. So with great gratitude, Koyana, for listening. We would really like to hear from you and your thoughts about how you might be able to implement these protocols within your work. For our Indigenous colleagues and those working in communities, please feel welcome to share your thoughts and experiences. Koyana.